Hello, this is part 3 of Who Runs This Place? Political Conventions versus Written Constitutions and Written Constitutions versus Steering Groups. Now, with the advent of the US Constitution, which I detailed the historical process to get there, to get to the US Constitution, and why the US Constitution and the English Constitution is different. The English Constitution works on mostly on political conventions. In recent years, with the Human Rights Act, with the Data Protection Act, with the Freedom of Information Act, there have been several moves to make the UK Constitution in line with the European Constitution, and this is being done through the House of Lords and the Supreme Court, which has just been created. Now, this puts the UK on a statutory basis of law, okay? But political conventions are still extremely important. Political conventions such as the Parliament doesn't openly criticise the Queen. Parliament sits not as a statute under a written law, that is, but it sits as a convention. On the other side, the royal family, the Queen, who opens and closes Parliament, has the power to close Parliament if the government was to do something unconstitutional. But if the Queen was to do something unconstitutional, there's an argument as to whether she would any longer be Queen, because there's the political convention that the Queen can be tried by the highest court in the land, and whether that is now the Supreme Court, which works under European law, constitutional statute law, or the House of Lords. For a long time, the House of Lords, after the monarchy became subservient to the Houses of Parliament, the House of Lords was the main body. And it's arguable that since the House of Lords deals with most European legislation, that the House of Lords is still dominant, and the House of Lords has an advisory capacity to the to Westminster. It can't overrule Westminster because that's another political convention, because the House of Commons is elected by the people. Okay? But does this really mean that the House of Commons is in charge of the country? Well, the House of Commons holds the government in itself. It is a parliamentary system, so the executive and the legislature are fused in the Prime Minister. Now, the Prime Minister has far more power, constitutionally speaking, than the American President does. The American President under the US Constitution is basically a figurehead, head of state, but he is also the head of the executive, which means he's the chief law enforcement officer of the country. And the police are part of the executive, the army is part of the executive, the courts are not part of the executive, they carry out the executive's wishes. The courts will say in both England and America that we do not make law, we merely follow it through. But with the common law system, is this really true? Now let's take the case of Roe versus Wade in the United States Constitution. For conservatives in the United States, and by conservatives I mean people who believe in the US Constitution, the true nature of American conservatism, which is really to the left of, far to the left of Thatcherism or anything like that in the UK. Roe versus Wade was a conflict between constitutional statutes and court-made statutes. because of the abortion laws in the United States, Roe versus Wade changed that, and thus they had to make an amendment to the Constitution. Now, an amendment to the Constitution can only be done constitutionally through a 2/3 majority in the Congress, both the Senate and the House of Representatives. Another thing for American conservatives or constitutionalists, both in the Democrats and in the Republicans, that have a problem with this, is that one particular amendment that created the Federal Reserve System, one of the most powerful, probably equal in power to the European Central Bank, because the Federal Reserve is the central bank, this system is partially governmental and partially private, because the banks that make up the Federal Reserve System are private banks. The Wall Street even has the ability to choose the Federal Reserve chairman of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. This is regulatory capture. Now, regulators, by and large, such as the Bank of England, such as the Financial Services Agency, are in constant danger of being captured by the businesses which they're supposed to be regulating. So this is really comes down to the nature of power. Political conventions, such as you cannot criticise banks, are extremely powerful outside of the political world, and the government doesn't attack banks, or hasn't before this crisis, because it has been a political convention that you don't attack private business politically. This has been quite harmful because there's been no analysis by the public of who actually controls political power. Now, if you had a situation such as in Saudi Arabia, where there was regulatory capture because the government regulates terrorism, in that it regulates and limits the amount of violence that happens. If terrorists overtook the government, as has happened in Saudi Arabia, as has happened in Sudan, then we would be in extremely dangerous territory. Luckily, I'd argue that hasn't happened in the West, because we have law enforcement and executive that prevent terrorism from doing this. But there are simply power issues which then become political conventions. Certain organised crime groups will not be attacked by the government. Certain terrorist groups will not be attacked by certain governments because they're simply too powerful. And that is unconstitutional, but it's just the way things are. That's the realist view. And this was the situation where a government that was similar to a Western type, the liberal democratic way of doing things in Yeltsin's time, was actually captured by organised crime and terrorism. They were subservient to the Russian mafia, who controlled 60% of the country's territory and wealth at the time. And they infiltrated the military and the central banking system. Now, today, the Russia United Party has decreased this down, which is Putin and Medvedev's party, have decreased this down to only a quarter of the Russian situation. But there is always this danger for the West. Now, when the banking system went through its crisis, the City of London, in a sense, had regulatory capture over the government and over the FSA and over the Bank of England. And in part 4 I will detail this more.